Hi, this is Misha, and I have been asked for the last couple of years to do more of an in-depth history on the Kalashnikov AK rifle series. So this is going to be part one, and there will be several parts. Full disclosure, there will be some retreading here of our older videos. We have done several AK shooting videos where I've talked a little bit about the history. We also did a three-part general series last year looking at the AK variants and all, kind of comparing them a little bit. It's about 3 hours total with each one, looking through as many countries as I could get my hands on. And we've just, done AKs here and there, but people have asked about histories, and, it was a hot summer day, not much to do outside, so I figured it was time to really get into the nitty-gritty of the history. I guess this is kind of a video blog article. I used to do blog articles, and this really is better suited for that, but people prefer videos these days, so I'll do my best on these histories. I will get things wrong. Full disclosure, I'm going off memory here, things like that. I will get things wrong. I will forget words. I will forget designations, so forgive me for that. If it's anything major, we'll put corrections in the description or elsewhere, put little pop-ups up. So, the history. Now, we did a video earlier this year comparing Kalashnikov and his AK to Schmeiser and his STG-44 MP44. And there's a lot of history about both developers in there, plus the early history of the AK. This video is going to kind of pick off where that video left off. So, in a way, that's kind of a prequel to this one. So if you haven't watched it, you might want to. We'll put it in the playlist. Well, before we get into it, I'll announce what I'm holding. This is my Russian AK Type 3 build. This would have been produced from about 1954 to 1958-59 in Russia. It is a milled receiver gun, really the last of the milleds, built from a PLO parts kit. And also on the table is just a gun I really think is cool. This is my Polish KBG WZ 1960. This is the Polish milled AK version. Specifically, this is the grenade launching variant with this shutoff on the gas block here. This was assembled by Gordon Tech at the behest of Arsenal around 2000-2001 from an original Polish kit on a Bulgarian forged machined receiver. So it's pretty dang close to original. This one does have a pressed in and pinned in barrel, which is a newer style, but this one here, which was assembled by Firing Line, does have the original screw-in style barrel, so that's nice because the receiver is a Firing Line. Really, there have not been any foreign receivers imported that are the true original screw-in. We'll get to that in a little bit later, but if you see a screwed-in gun with a barrel screwed in attached to the receiver that way, it's either a US receiver, as on this one, or it's one of the magnificent re-welds that people like Turbo have done. So it's really your only options. Your Chinese imports and your Bulgarian imports will all be the press and pin. So, on to the history, the development. Mikhail Kalashnikov was born in 1919, November 10th. We share a birthday, which is kind of neat to me. He, as a young man, was always interested in mechanical things. Before joining the Army in 1938, he worked briefly at a railroad in Russia. He also worked some time as a young teenager at a couple of different factories, manufactories in Russia. At that time, Russia was rapidly modernizing, so there was a big push to teach young people how to work machines and tooling and such. He joined the military, quickly rose in the ranks to become a sergeant by the time of World War II. He was always interested in all things mechanical. He served in tanks, and he was known for disassembling all kinds of parts of tanks And in some units, in some divisions of the Red Army, that would have gotten you censured or even cashiered. But luckily, he had a good commanding officer that recognized his potential. So instead of censuring him, he was transferred to Leningrad, and he helped design a shell counter for tanks. He also helped design an improved track system for tanks and an improved sighting device. In fact, his accomplishments were recognized enough that General Zhukov awarded him a presentation watch, which isn't bad for a man who's barely 20 years old. So before the war, he was working in factories, helping design things, helping quality control assure his own designs when they were coming out of the factory. However, when the Germans invaded during Operation Barbarossa, 1941, he was called back to active frontline service, was a senior sergeant. He commanded a tank, and in September that year, he was involved in heavy fighting. In October, he was evacuated from the front because he was severely injured by a shell fragment exploding in his tank, and it really hurt his shoulder, but also tore up other parts of his body in a pretty good way. He was in hospital for 4 to 6 months, and he was released for convalescence in early 1942. While in the hospital, a few things happened to Kalashnikov. For one, he heard a lot of other soldiers, obviously wounded, so their experiences in combat weren't all that great. Also, at the time, Russia was retreating from the German onslaught, and the soldiers were complaining about a lot of the infantry weapons that were being issued to the Russians at the time. Keep in mind, they were going to go for the SVT-40. That was supposed to be the new self-loading rifle, but it was having issues, production delays, and then the Germans coming in really kind of put a halt to that because the factories had to be evacuated. So in 1941, 1942, an effort was made to switch back to the trusty old Mosin Nagant 9130, a bolt-action rifle. Now, Russia did have a couple of really good submachine guns. Early on, they had the PPSH-41, which, while good, it was just coming into service in 1941, obviously. They had the PPD before it, but it had some issues, but they did have a few PPDs to use. There was a few different versions. Later, they would come out with the PPS-42, designed by Sudiev, and in the improved version, the PPS-43 would go into mass production. So Russia would have quite a bit of submachine guns. This was because the soldiers recognized how effective the German MP-40 was. Now, ironically, a lot of the German soldiers kind of envied the Russians' SVT-40. Either way, the Mosin Nagant was kind of seen as obsolete, and a lot of soldiers weren't happy to be issued one. At the same time, Kalashnikov did a lot of reading while in hospital and afterwards. In particular, he read a book written by Fedorov, a Russian who designed arguably the first assault rifle, or tried to design the first assault rifle prior to World War I. It was a select fire weapon. In production, it fired the 6.5 Arasaka cartridge, but during development, he wanted to design a 6.5 intermediate cartridge for it back around 1913. Obviously, the war got in the way and this had to be shelved. So he had the concept in his head for an assault rifle, as we would know it today, early on. Unfortunately, the metallurgy, the engineering, and the cartridge manufacturing of the day really wasn't up to it. But either way, Kalashnikov was heavily influenced by that. So when he got out of the hospital, he designed a submachine gun. It was not successful, but it was a closed-bolt, striker-fired design, and it showed his potential. Again, he's still a very young man. A lot of the other Russian designers, Sudiev, Simonov, Tokarev, are getting on in years. So he ends up going to the proving grounds outside of Moscow, working on guns. Now, also in 1942, the Soviet government captured quite a few of the German MKB-42H designed by Hanel, along with its 8x33mm Kurz cartridge. Now we have a couple of different videos on the STG-44's history, so I don't want to go into it here. This is already going to be a long enough and probably boring enough video. So check those out if you're interested. But let's just say that Russia, by 1942-43, was starting to get some of these guns that they captured. At the same time, they were given M1 Garands and, more importantly, M1 Carbines by America. So they had the M1 Garand there to study. They also had the M1 Carbine and its 7.62 by 33 30 caliber U.S. Carbine cartridge, which is nearly an intermediate cartridge. It's still technically a pistol cartridge because it's a straight wall with a round bullet, but it's very, very close to being an intermediate cartridge. They had those to study. They quickly decided that they wanted their next, not just gun, but family of guns to fire an intermediate cartridge. 1943, they work on a design, and by November of that year, they actually released specifications to different Soviet cartridge manufacturers for what was known as the 7.62 by 41 M43 round, which was their first intermediate cartridge. Again, heavily influenced by both 8mm Kerrs and 30 caliber U.S. Carbine. It really takes kind of the dimensions of both and combines them. It's a bottlenecked cartridge, like 8mm Kerrs, but it's a 30 caliber like, 30 caliber carbine. By 1944, there were as many as 10 assault rifles on the drawing board to fire the new cartridge, so quite a few designers were interested in designing for it. Russia wanted a select fire infantry rifle, assault rifle, to fire it. They also wanted a light machine gun to fire it. They wanted a self-loading carbine to fire it, so analogous to like an SVT-40. And they wanted a bolt-action rifle to fire it, analogous to the Mosin Nagant. Well, of those, the bolt-action pretty much fell by the wayside. Very few, if any, prototypes were made, gone. The self-loading rifle obviously became the SKS, officially adopted in 1945. It was designed by Semenov, who had been having this ongoing kind of competition with Tokarev to design and get adopted a self-loading rifle in Russia since the late 20s. And for the light machine gun, we have the Dmitriev RPD-44, which is officially adopted in 1944, although it didn't go into service until much later, and we'll address it in a different video. But it was a belt-fed weapon firing at that time 7.62 by 41 intermediate cartridge. So that left the assault rifle, which was the last really to be designed. With so many on the board, 10 designs, it took some time. An early favorite was what became known as the AS-44 by Sudiev, the designer of the PPS submachine gun. There was also a design by Tokarev, the AT-45. The Tokarev design didn't go much of anywhere. The Sudiev design was actually put into limited production. It was ordered to go into limited production in the middle towards the end of 1944, and a test batch was made, and it was even sent to soldiers in 1945 for them to try out in the field and see what they thought about it. They liked it. They decided that it had better range and accuracy than a PPS submachine gun, yet it was lighter and handier than a full-sized rifle. Unfortunately, Sudiev was very sick at the time. I believe he had leukemia. I know it was a form of cancer of some type, and he passed away a short time later. This basically left the AS-44 an orphan design. So by 1946, it was essentially dead. Now, going back to Kalashnikov, he had been working at the Moscow Proving Grounds and had worked with the AS-44 and was even, some sources claim, on Sudiev's team, but as a junior minor member. I don't want to say he designed it, but he was exposed to the AS-44 for sure. The Tokarev design pretty much fell by the wayside at the same time. So in 1946, the war's over. The Trials Commission in Soviet Russia still wants an assault rifle for the new cartridge, but the pressure is kind of off. They have time. They can do it right. They don't feel the pressure. They announce the next round of trials, and this is where Kalashnikov comes in. He had had a few other prototypes in 1944 and 1945, heavily inspired by the Garand. His next prototype, first called the AK number 1, which had a milled receiver, and the AK number 2, which had a heavy gauge stamped receiver. It's not like the stamped receiver we know today. It was much thicker steel, kind of like these mags here, which are stamped steel. These would go into trials and be accepted as the AK-46 experimental prototype model of Kalashnikov, 1946. And they would go up against a few other designs. Originally there were 16 designs. This was quickly pared down to 6 and then down to 3. The other two major competitors were the Vulcan AB-46 and the Demintev AD-46. These guns would be tested in late 1946, November, December of that year, and frankly, none of them did well. And honestly, of the three, the Kalashnikov was probably at the lowest end of the spectrum. The AB and the AD proved themselves to be more ergonomic and more accurate. The AK proved itself to possibly be a little more reliable and durable, though. Now remember, the early AK-46 is not like this gun here in a lot of ways. It has a 2-piece receiver with a hinge-down trigger group. It used a short-stroke gas piston system. It was still above the barrel, but it was closer to it. It was more like on an SKS. How about I say it like that? The bolt system, the piston system, was more like an SKS, although it did use a rotating bolt, the Kalashnikov 2-lug style that he borrowed more or less from the M1 Carbine M1 Grand. It also had a non-reciprocating cocking handle, charging handle, on the left side, and it had a separate control for the fire mode and the safety. So we had 3 controls on the left, several other minor differences as well. Again, he did both a milled and a stamped receiver version. The stamp was more promising. It was a more modern technology. Really, Russia had experimented with stampings early on with its submachine guns, the PPSH-41, and more over the PPS-42 and PPS-43. But these are very crude stamped guns with very, very loose tolerances, submachine guns. So this was one of the early Soviet attempts at a rifle, a locked breech rifle. So the trials didn't go too well, even for the 7.62 by 41 caliber cartridge. The cartridge itself was discovered to be difficult to mass produce, and they were having a lot of instances of split case heads. So what they did in Russia, and this had nothing to do with Kalashnikov or any of the other designers, they reworked the 7.62 by 41 into what we know today as 7.62 by 39. The point of confusion here is they kept the M43 year designator. The rework happened in either late 45 or 46. What they did, they shortened the case and they lengthened the projectile. Now, since none of the guns did too great and the cartridge might have been to blame, they told the designers, including Kalashnikov, they were allowed to rework their guns for the new cartridge. And it was essentially just supposed to be a rechambering. And that's what the other two designers did. Essentially they updated their guns, that they received different designations, but essentially they were the same. Kalashnikov, on the other hand, designed what we know today is the AK-47. Now, he didn't just redesign it for the new cartridge, he copied a lot and changed it. As you can tell, the AK-47 is very different from the AK-46. He actually lifted quite a bit from the Vulcan AB design because it worked. Namely, he took the long stroke gas piston, which is connected to the carrier. He also took the non-reciprocating charging handle. So basically he copied the bolt carrier, although he kept his bolt. Inspired by the AS-44, the Sudiev, he loosened things up even further. The AK-46 was always designed to kind of be a loose design for reliability, but he took that even a step further with the AK-47 prototypes, loosening up the inside, having a lot of hollow space in here, a lot of clearances for stuff to get in and not get in the way. And he copied the selector switch from a somewhat unlikely source. This actually came from the Remington Model 8, which was designed by John Moses Browning. Now, it seems kind of odd that a Remington Model 8, which was predominantly a sporting gun with very, very, very little military use in World War I, would come to the attention of a designer like Kalashnikov. But the reason it did, the Remington Model 8 was very popular in Russia. So quite a few were around, so he took that. There were several other changes, but you get the idea. He borrowed heavily, came up with the AK-47. He had 4 different major prototypes, number 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 through 3 had fixed wood stocks. 4 had an underfolding stock, which was basically copied from the MP40. These would go into trials. Well, let me back up. He would officially complete the AK-47 prototypes in November of 1947, and they would go into trials beginning in December of 47, running through 1948. In the end, the Trials Commission selected the Kalashnikov. The Balkan and Demintev designs were still more accurate, but the Kalashnikov was felt to be cheaper to produce and more reliable. Also, Kalashnikov was getting away with a little bit of mischief. He had been working at the Moscow Proving Grounds since at least 1944. He knew people, he used his connections. Really, he should have been disqualified after the 1946-47 round of trials with the AK-46 because it didn't do very well. But he used his connections, got a second chance, and even though the AK-47 wasn't clearly superior, he kind of pulled strings. It was there, he knew people, and it worked out well for him. You know, hard to say. You read one thing and another, and I don't want to get into it, and I don't want to make him sound like he was a sycophant or an insider, but, you know, by this point, he had been recognized for the better part of a decade as a young, up-and-coming designer in Russia. Also, he was a great poster boy. He was a peasant, the very definition of a peasant, and look what he's doing. He's a skilled engineer. So it politically was a very good decision, and they knew he was young and they could use him for many years to come. Not unlike why Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space, is he was a young, brash Soviet pilot who they could use as propaganda. But either way, the AK-47 number 2 and the AK-47 number 4 were both selected for further testing and eventual adoption, along with the new 7.62x39 M43 cartridge. The other designs at this point just pretty much fall away. So, when Kalashnikov was making his prototypes, he was sent to the Kaffarov Arsenal outside of Moscow. 1948, since it was planned on being officially adopted, Kalashnikov, along with his design, was transferred to the Izhevsk Arsenal, today what we know as Izhmash. It became Izhmash in the 90s. But at that time it was the Izhevsk Arsenal, which was a major manufacturing center in Russia then and still is today. 1948, there was one more prototype called the AK-48, which Kalashnikov designed to be hopefully more accurate. Unfortunately, it worked well, but they didn't see enough of an improvement to switch to it during the middle of setting up for production, so the AK-48 was pretty much abandoned. They stuck with the AK-47. Finally, here we go. In 1949, the AK-47 number 2 became the AK rifle in Russia. It was adopted as just simply the AK, the automatic Kalashnikov. And the AK-47 number 4 became the AKS in 1949, which was the underfolding version. basically just folding stock. So both were adopted in 1949. Both had originally stamped receivers, and we call these today Type 1 AKs. Now, there are major differences. This, as I said, is a Type 3. There are differences between a Type 1 and a Type 3, obviously. Type 1 has a heavy gauge stamped receiver. It has a front trunnion that the barrel screws into that's welded into the front of the stamped receiver. It has a socket in the back for the buttstock. It has the sling swivel, interestingly, located up on the handguard retainer here and back further on the buttstock, not dissimilar to what we'll see later on the AKM. The pistol grip is different. It's actually a two-piece kind of design, the way it's attached. And it was first introduced with these heavy-gauged slab-side steel magazines, which would continue in production in Russia through the 50s. It would have a chrome-lined 16-inch barrel, same as this one. It's a pretty heavy profile for the cartridge. It would be threaded 14 millimeter, same as on this one. It had a bayonet lug under the front sight tower, just like on this one. I'll attach a bayonet. And that was the Type 1. Unfortunately, while I'm doing this, I'll talk. Unfortunately, the stamped receiver was very problematic for Izhevsk. They had been working with milled receivers, machined receivers, throughout World War II. Mosin Nagant, Tokarev, the SKS. So they were very familiar and comfortable with machined receivers. They went to try to do a stamped receiver, and the receivers themselves did not fail. But there was a very high rejection rate by quality control at the factory. They were having problems with incorrect welds, warping of the receiver walls, so on and so forth. So they petitioned in late 1949 or early 1950 to the Soviet powers that be to switch to a machined receiver. This was approved a short time later, and in 1951 the Type 2 AK went into production in Izhevsk. Now the Type 2 would have a machined receiver pretty darn similar to this one. It's a single piece, the barrel screws in. The biggest difference with the Type 2 is instead of having the tangs for the stock in the back, top and bottom, there would be a socket. And the reason the Type 2 had a socket in the back is so they could use the same basic receiver for both the underfolding and the fixed stock. They just put in essentially a different adapter in the back for either an underfolding or a fixed stock. It also had a heavier top cover. Now, even though this is a Type 3 gun, this top cover is actually off a Type 2. As you see, it's very thick, very slab. There's no lightning cuts to say, there's no bends. It's just a solid, heavy receiver. As you see, the bayonet locks on under the front sight and comes back here and just wraps around the barrel loosely. There's no lug under here, there's just a ring for the cleaning rod. The bolt carrier is left in the white, as is the bolt, to make it smoother. The rest of the metal would be military grade, but still quite high quality blued. The wood would be, well, Russian wood that we pretty much all know. Usually you'll find laminate wood because it was stronger, and they would do kind of 90-degree laminations for strength. They would move the sling swivels to the now familiar place on the milled Russian style, up here on the gas block and on the rear part of the receiver. And then they would go to what we know today as the Type 3 in 1953. And this was the final version of the original AK in Russia. The Type 3 is what I'm holding here. As you can see, they went to two different receiver styles. for underfolding or fixed. They went to what we would basically know today as a modern pistol grip. At least it attaches the modern way. It's still a two-piece in a sense. It has this metal ferrule at the top where the wood goes into, and then it's just a straight wood grip with a screw running through the bottom. The Type 3 dust cover, which is actually on this gun over here, we'll look at in just a second, is a little bit lighter gauge steel, and it has some ribbing horizontally running around the edges to give it strength. And the Type 3 would really be the quintessential AK. And it would be produced from 1953-54, sources kind of argue, till 1958-59 in Russia. Notice I'm saying AK now. This is something that has come up in quite a few of our videos when I call it an AK-47. This is one of those things. Yes, the prototype was an AK-47. When it was adopted in Russia, it simply became the AK. However, if you say AK in America, people aren't really sure what you might mean. You might mean the later AKM, you might even mean an AK-74, heck, you might even mean an RPK. So for specificity, myself and quite a few others use AK-47 to denote a Russian-style milled receiver AK. Just because if you say AK-47 to most collectors, they know we're talking about a gun like this. Even though AK is the correct nomenclature. But if you say that, it sounds very generic. So it's something that is said incorrectly, but intentionally so. Hope that makes sense some. While Izhevsk and later Tula would produce the AK in Russia, it was the Type 3 design that started to be exported to many other friendly communist nations. In my hands is a Polish example. As I said, this is a Polish WZ-60 parts kit assembled here, but on a Bulgarian original import receiver. Poland would originally want to manufacture, well, not want, that's the wrong word. They would originally plan to manufacture the AK and the SKS beginning around 1956, but they would drop the SKS because it was pretty well pointless. They would set up AK production, and they would start to produce them in the late 50s, even though the model number seems to be 1960. How it is. They would basically copy the late AK Type 3, still have a 16-inch chrome-lined barrel, 14mm threads with a nut on. As I said, this one has a grenade-launching gas block. The Polish slings are a little different. This is the Type 1. They have several different types. Hello. As you can tell, instead of having a metal clip, it's leather up here, which I think is really cool. It has a very large buckle, very large leather piece. The Type 2 would go to more of a traditional AK metal D-ring here, but it would still use a smaller leather buckle, so on and so forth. This has the true Type 3 upper receiver, dust cover. You can see the ridge here along the edge. It's thinner steel, but they put that in there for strength. Polish guns would originally have hardwood as opposed to laminate. They would also go to laminate later. They would first use wood pistol grips, very similar to Russia, a little more squared off. Later, they would soon go to a checkered Bakelite type grip though. The buttstock, there's a few different versions. This one has these brackets to allow for attaching a rubber boot for launching grenades. Other Polish guns would not have these. Sling swivels would be earlier located on the side of the receiver, same as Russian. Later they would move them to the rear of the buttstock, at the bottom of the buttstock, excuse me. On this gun, we have a latch back here to lock the dust cover. Up is locked. This is again for launching grenades, so a lot of your Polish WZ-60s won't have that. And just like on the Russian, and I didn't point it out earlier, apologies, we have a trapdoor in the butt plate. Pull it out, why not? For a pellet style kit. This has both cleaning and disassembly tools in it. We have a bore brush, a jag, a punch, and there's oftentimes a trigger, a little nub in there for disassembling the trigger and getting it back in. Part of standard cleaning was to actually take the trigger groups out of these at various times. This fires, of course, the 7.62 by 39 cartridge. I have a later ribbed pattern mag. This is Polish. I have not seen an earlier Polish slab sight. I think by the time they went into production in Poland, the ribbed mag was starting to be used, and that's what they built. Mostly Poland built these in the 60s. You see 60s dates. It seems like they were building them up until the early 70s. Polish quality. These were built at the Luxnik, the Circle 11 factory at Radom. And again, are very close copies. China would begin producing a very close copy, licensed copy, of the AK Type 3 in 1956, calling it the Type 56. The earliest guns would be assembled in China from Russian parts with Russian supervisors. As the decade wore on, they would use more and more Chinese parts. And eventually they would go to complete independence and autonomy. And then, of course, in the 60s, relations between China and Russia would fall apart. But the early Chinese guns would look pretty much the same. They had a few interesting features, such as the hooded front sight. This is the bayonet for that Polish, by the way. Very similar to the Russian. East Germany would also produce a version of the AK for a pretty brief period of time. They were slow in the beginning. They were producing at the Ernst Thälmann factory, which is actually the old Sauer & Son factory before the end of World War II. And they would produce them in pretty slow numbers because they had some production issues. They were having problems with quality control, getting things down right. So even though they started around 1958, 1959, they didn't really go full scale to around 1960, 1961. The East German gun, obviously none were ever imported as semi-autos here, and very, very few true parts kits have been imported. The gun was called the MPI, which is basically what they would designate all their Kalashnikov guns, machine pistol. And it was called simply the MPI-K for Kalashnikov. It was a Type 3, except it lacked the cleaning rod under the barrel. So in addition to not having the rod here, it would not have a hole in the retainer or a loop under the gas block for it. It would also not have the trapdoor and the buttstock for a cleaning kit. The German cleaning kit was the tobacco tin we know today, and it was carried on the belt. So the East German guns will look very similar, but they will not have any of the cleaning kit provisions. They would, as I said, produce them into the early 60s until transitioning over. Romania would use the AK Type 3, but they would not build their own. They would purchase theirs from Russia. Now, they might have made some locally. They might have made at the Cougar Arsenal some small parts and furniture, but for the most part, the Romanian guns were Russian built. I have not found what Romania designated them. I would assume it was something PM, either PM with a year or just simply PM for the early ones. They would not have many, and they would not use them long before switching over themselves. Hungary would be another major known producer of the AK Type 3. They would designate it as the AK-55 for the year of adoption. They would go into production a short time later, and they would produce a good number. Now, the thing about Hungarian guns, much like with China, the early ones were produced with Russian parts and Russian supervision at the FEG arsenal. which was Circle 2, if memory serves, 02. It's unclear as time went on how many of the parts on the Hungarian guns were still Russian and how many were Hungarian domestically made. The furniture is clearly Hungarian, but some of the internals, the bolts and things, look suspiciously Russian, so it's hard to say. But they did make one. It looked very similar to the Russian, except it had more blonde wood, and it had a checkered pistol grip. It was square like this one, but it was checkered on each side. So it's kind of interesting. There's also Finland, but that's the Valmet, and that's really a whole different story that I don't want to get in here today. Sorry. One more, though, that would use the original milled AK pattern was Bulgaria. In fact, they still make a modified version of the milled receiver today, which is this one's built on. In Bulgaria, the first guns would be Russian. They would transition over to producing their own in the 60s at the famous Arsenal Circle 10 factory that we all know today, or most of us at least, I think. They would originally just call them the AK-47 or AK. Sources differ again. It's kind of getting to that nomenclature thing. Later, they would do an updated version called the AK-47 M1, and from there they would explode. Bulgaria was really the biggest fan of the Russian pattern milled receiver, even more so than China, definitely more than Russia. As I said, they're still making milled type guns today, and they would do the underfolding version as well as a more modern side folding, which is really not an AK Type 3 at this point. But they would do a copy of the underfolder, which is kind of interesting. A lot of countries did not make the underfolding version. They would be made in China as the Type 56-1, but I have not seen a proven underfolding Polish version. I know there's a few kits that claim to be Polish underfolders. I'm not doubting their veracity. I just have not found one. Now, interestingly, in Poland, they did do a version of this gun here with the quick detachable stock called the WZ60/72. It used a modified version of the stock. It even used the same tangs. They were just shortened, and there were two spring-loaded buttons you would squeeze, and the stock would just pull out of the receiver. These were done for airborne. They would not do very many at all, 500, 1,000, but it's an interesting version, and that seems to be what Poland used instead of the folding stock. They just went to a QD stock, so kind of like the American Thompson, in a way. Romania might have purchased some AKSs from Russia, probably did. Did not make their own, as I said, and I have not seen a Hungarian underfolder. I think these guns were in production for such brief times in these foreign countries outside of Russia that they just never got around to doing many variations. The AKM would quickly appear, and we'll get to that in the next episode. One other country who would do a milled gun was Yugoslavia. This is a Zastava Model 70. This was actually the second pattern of milled that they would do. Bolt hold open mag. You see it's empty. Yugoslavia, much like with their SKS, which they started to make very late. In fact, Yugoslavia started to make the SKS so late that Russia just gave them the production line. All these other countries nominally purchased the rights from Russia, although since it was communism, it was kind of a different setup. But they went to the SKS in 1959, and they started to build copies of the AK around 1964, 1965, but they did their own thing. Zastava has always done its own thing. It's not as close of an ally to Russia during the Warsaw, during the Comm Block era, but it did get the production line. The original guns did not really have a designation, and they were never officially adopted, although many saw use, and they made thousands for commercial sale and testing and all that. Starting at the muzzle, we still have a 16-inch chrome-lined barrel, still 14mm threads. But we do not have the bayonet lug under the sight block. We have an AKM style lug under the gas block. Speaking of the gas block, it has a flip up grenade sight. This is the early milled pattern with this track here for it to ride in. This will cut off the gas and gives you grenade sights. We have a ported gas tube like on AK Type 3s. Here's a big difference. We have a extended handguard. Now, not majorly extended, but as you see, we have 3 vent holes instead of 2. We have the AK style slab side. So that's kind of interesting. We still have a heavy wall top cover. It's very much inspired by the AK Type 2 cover without much in the way of cuts or dimples or stamp marks. We have a non-lightning cut bolt and carrier, like an AK. We have a machined receiver. Now this has this pin in the back. This retains the latch. If you press it in, you can push the latch forward and it locks and you can open. This was their method for locking, securing the dust cover, unlike the Polish style. Moving back, we have a major difference here. This buttstock does not have tangs. Rather, it goes into the receiver. There's a socket, not too dissimilar to an AK Type 2, although it is very different, but kind of the same principle. There's one long screw running all the way from the back all the way into the receiver, so there is no storage in this stock. Instead, we have a rubber recoil pad, again for helping launch grenades and keeping it comfy. Flipping her over, here's the other side of this button, you can see. Rear swing swivel is on the receiver. Front one is on the gas block. Now that was and the original types, Model 64 as collectors call them, had a wood pistol grip. This is a Model 70. This was the version first adopted by the Yugoslavian military. We still have a milled receiver, but it is simplified. If you notice, there's not a lightning cut on the left side. There's one on the right, similar to the Soviet pattern. Excuse me. But not one on the left. Also, the M70 has a pressed and pinned-in barrel. This would be correct. The original so-called M64 would have a screw-in barrel. The M70 would have a pressed and pinned-in barrel. So they were simplifying the receiver, trying to make it faster, easier to mass produce. The original M64 would also have an internal last round hold open device, but by the M70 they would drop that and they would go to the much more simplified style we know today with a magazine with the bolt hold open follower. Not as good as a device, but it made things more parts compatible with other Kalashnikovs and it cheapened production. That was pretty much what they were doing with the M70, which was what they would eventually adopt. It was a cheapened up version of the M64, taking some AKM features, but still retaining quite a few of the AK Type 2, 3 features, including again this heavy barrel and the ported gas tube and the non-lightning cut and all that. Something that some had were flip-up night sights, but not all. Here's the front. The rear is here. Folds down. There we go. There. And you'll see night sights appearing on Russian and other guns too. Usually they would add an N designator to the name to denote night sight. And the Yugoslavians would have them. Now, these would go into production in the early 70s, and they would make this version, and they would also do an underfolding version. The underfolder was called the M70A. And Zastava would make a bunch of different versions of the M70. Now, interestingly, when they did the M70A, they would use the AKMS style underfolding stock. I'm sorry I don't have an original AKS underfolder. I've had them in the past, I just don't have one right now. If you check the AKM video, we'll talk about that more, because I do have a gun that has a stock like it that'll be in that video. They would make approximately 10 million of these around the world, Russia and China being the two biggest producers. And these are still in combat in various war-torn areas today, oftentimes quite shot out. They were used quite famously against Israel by the PLO and other Arab nations. They've been used in Afghanistan for a long time. They aren't the most ergonomic. They aren't the most accurate, although that's more down to the shooter, the sights, and the 7.62-39 cartridge, to be honest. The gun itself isn't inherently inaccurate. But they are reliable. They are very easy to field strip and maintain. And we have a couple of videos of me taking these apart, so I'm not doing it today, but you can check those out. They were pretty inexpensive to mass produce by the standards of the 40s and 50s. I mean, most people were still using machine receivers back then, so that wasn't abnormal. But by the 60s, they were starting to be, the original AK that is, were starting to be quite expensive to produce, especially in the millions that Russia and others wanted to make them in. They were also getting heavy. This gun, or versions of it, weigh about 9.5 pounds, give or take, depending on exact configuration. So again, by the 40s, not a very heavy gun, not light, but not very heavy. But again, by the 60s, starting to get a pretty chunky reputation. That was pretty much as brief as I could make the development history of this thing. Like I said, I know I skipped over some things and probably got a few other things wrong. Apologize for that. But anyway, if you have any questions or comments, we really welcome them below. I love talking AKs anytime. If you like the video, please click like, and also check out some of our other videos on AKs and other military type guns. If you haven't already subscribed, and if you could, we really appreciate it. Each and every subscriber, we really do appreciate, because we're still doing this for free. We're still doing it just for the fun of it, you know, sharing guns and just talking about them. So the only thing we really get out of it is just your viewership. So we really do appreciate every one of you. Well, as always, this is Misha. And please tune in again next time for more hopefully unique and interesting videos. We'll catch you then.